I've been at Investec for almost 19 years now, and Investec has been a fantastic place to work over that period. Well, Brexit's the term that describes the possible departure of Great Britain from the European Union. The global economy, it's in a very tricky place right now. Well, Brexit's the term that describes the possible departure of Great Britain from the European Union. As a lot of people know now, the UK will have a referendum on the UK's membership of the EU on the 23rd of June. It's a subject which is engulfing a lot of people, certainly in the office. But, when I go and play tennis, when I go down the pub, you can't really avoid the conversation. So it's a really big deal. The UK's been a member of the EU since 1973. We had a referendum in 1975, which, of course, resulted in a yes, stay decision. But there are lots of nerves, not just in industry, but around in markets about a possible leave vote, which would remove the UK from the European Union. If you're looking at the euro, I think I was one of those people in the early 90s that didn't like the idea of having monetary union without political union, or at least a lot more integration in terms of the institutional and cultural areas of euro members. And I think looking at the euro project, how far are we now? 17 years on. The crisis that we had in the euro area from around 2010, I think, has highlighted the fact that you've got so many divergences in terms of economic performance for one, and also cultural differences for another thing. It's made it very difficult for the eurozone to recover, and it's made it much more vulnerable to crises such as the Greek crisis, which broke out in 2010. So I'm still not a great fan of the structure that there is there. The European Central Bank's done a very good job, as it's one of the few the pan-euro institutions which have got any clout. So it's been under a lot of strain. But I think if the Eurozone is to survive and to prosper properly, there has to be further integration. But that's a very, very difficult sell politically. In terms of the Brexit debate, it's necessary to draw a distinction between the euro, which is, or the Eurozone, which are the 19 European countries which use the single currency, and the European Union, which is the wider set of 28 nations, including the UK. In Britain, there is a widespread feeling that there is too much intervention from Brussels, the centre of European Union power, that Britain loses a certain amount of sovereignty, that there's too much regulation that's imposed from Brussels, and that perhaps Britain would be better off outside the European Union. The debate is very, very wide, and I think that the things that I would be concerned about if the UK left the European Union would be the fact that we have free trade and access to what we call the single market in the European Union, the fact that the UK is a fantastic magnet for inward investment. It's the biggest recipient inside the EU, and that might well cease if we had the uncertainty of leaving the EU. And a third reason, to do with the internal dynamics of the UK, is that if Britain leaves the EU, then Scotland might demand and could well get a second referendum on independence from the UK, which could result in the breakup of the United Kingdom itself. So there are a lot of things to look at in terms of the wider debate. Looking at the internal dynamics on a Brexit, if we take Scotland, for example, Scotland tends to be, as a nation, very pro-European Union, and it's been made fairly clear by the Scottish Government in Edinburgh that if the UK as a whole leaves the EU, then Scotland would demand a referendum on independence from the UK. Now, that would depend on the Scottish vote actually coming down in favour of remaining within the European Union. But if that were the case, it might be difficult to deny Scotland another referendum. Of course, Scotland had a referendum on independence back in September 2014, and the result was no, we don't want independence, but that majority was about 10%. And that might well change in the event that Scotland demanded and obtained a second referendum. In that case, the UK's constitutional position would be that much more difficult. Not only is it leaving the European Union, but around 10% of it in terms of the population and GDP would be looking at leaving the UK. So you've got a multi-dimensional problem there. Again, from a financial market point of view, I don't think that would be particularly helpful. Britain outside the EU would bring a whole host of uncertainties, really. I think number one is that our trading relationship, not just with the rest of Europe, but with the rest of the world, would have a big question mark against it. We wouldn't have access to the European single market, and the terms of our relationship with the rest of Europe would have to be redefined, possibly over a prolonged period. But another factor, and not a lot of people realise this, is that a lot of the UK's trade deals with other countries in the world have been based on deals struck with the EU. And if the UK is outside the European Union, those trade agreements will cease, and Britain would then have to renegotiate 53 trade agreements with different groups of countries around the world. Now, that's a lot to get done in a negotiating frame of 2 years, which is what the European Union Treaty says. Totally unrealistic, and you've got a big uncertainty about our export industries and inward investment as well, and indeed the medium-term path of the economy. One of the potential implications of a Brexit is that you begin to launch sector-by-sector negotiations on trade access. One of the things that we enjoy as a European Union member is the exports of services and the passporting of financial deals all around the European Union. That would go if the UK left the European Union. It would be subject to negotiation with individual European Union countries. But if I were the leader of Germany, France, or indeed Ireland, I would be looking for a big slice of the UK's financial industry if it were no longer a European Union member and it no longer enjoyed the advantages of that single market in financial services. Well, one thing about the relationship we have with the rest of Europe is that we are a member of the European Union. We're not a member of the Euro. The Bank of England's remit is essentially as an independent central bank in the UK. So its remit on price stability, namely that it follows a targeted inflation rate of 2%, wouldn't change. Of course, we have independence over monetary policy, which means that the Bank of England can change interest rates or indeed do more quantitative easing, as it has done in previous years, if it feels the need to do that. And that's irrespective of whether we're a member of the European Union or not. Another important part of the Bank of England's role is financial stability. And again, we're all guided these days by global guidelines, and that wouldn't change. But of course, the Bank of England can set what we call its macro-prudential policy according to the best needs of the UK, whether we're out of the European Union or in. And indeed, this has been a major policy focus over the last 2 to 3 years in terms of regulating the mortgage markets and setting parameters, for example. And of course, the UK is a European Union member. There's been a big debate in the UK on the Prime Minister David Cameron's deal with the European Union. My own personal view was that it wasn't a great groundbreaking deal, and perhaps what the Prime Minister did was he had a fairly shrewd idea of what he could achieve, and he went for it and he got it. There are a few bits and pieces, I think, in the terms which are helpful. One applies to the limitation of in-work benefits to newly arrived EU migrants to the UK. That helps particularly from a political perspective, but also the enshrinement that in European Union law that you have euro ins, you have euro outs, and it's illegal to discriminate between them. And I think in the context of the position of the City of London and the financial services generally, that was an achievement. What people are actually voting on isn't quite clear. A lot of people are saying, well, British people want more control over migration. In the European Union, there is the free movement of people across all the 28 members' borders. That might be one factor. But a lot of people talk to me about it as an economist and say, well, we don't really feel very well informed about the debate. A lot of the debate, arguably on both sides, is couched in terms of rhetoric. And so I think if you can get away from just looking at the big headline questions on migration and red tape and actually investigate the real issues, I think that would be a very positive step forward in actually promoting a more rational debate on the subject. In my personal view, I'm not particularly convinced by the economic case for the UK leaving the European Union. I'm very concerned about the UK's external trading relationships. I'm not particularly convinced that not having to comply with European Union rules would really help, largely because a lot of trade is done with the EU, and that would still be subject to EU regulation. It might help certain businesses in the UK with a domestic focus, that they probably do have a large amount of red tape. But I think if you're looking at the net benefit to the economy from Brexit, I'm not convinced of the case, and that's my personal view. Looking at the risks of a Brexit, it's always very difficult to know precisely what financial markets have priced in and what they've disregarded. But what we saw in February, soon after David Cameron struck the deal with the European Council, was that the setting of a date for the referendum and indeed the London Mayor Boris Johnson's decision to join the Leave camp caused some shockwaves in financial markets, and we had a sharp fall in sterling in the currency the week after. My suspicion is that markets are partially pricing in the risk of the UK leaving the European Union, but not fully. So if we were to see a leave vote on the 23rd of June, you'd see further downward pressure on sterling. You might see some upward pressure on government borrowing costs, on gilt yields, and also you'd see some reaction in stock markets as well. There are some implications on the rest of Europe from a Brexit vote, if there were a vote in the UK to leave. And that's that we've had some rise in various countries on a populist anti-European Union ticket. I don't know of any European Union government standing on those terms, but certainly in terms of opposition parties, there's a lot of noise being generated in a few countries now. It may well be that Brussels, the centre of the European Union, views that with some disquiet, and that if any of those minority voices came to power in those individual countries, that they may well have to deal with some sort of exit terms. So to make an example of those countries, they might want to set the terms of a potential UK exit to be very, very stringent, which would make life difficult for the UK. In terms of other separatist groups, of course, a great example here is Spain, where we know that we've got a big separatist movement in Catalonia. Now, the Catalans don't want to leave the European Union, but they do want to leave Spain. But it's been made clear by the Spanish government that, for a start, any referendum in Catalonia would be illegal under the Spanish constitution. But if Catalonia were to leave Spain, then they would have to leave the European Union and become an accession country and start the application from scratch. And in that case, giving the UK easy terms, even though the situation was different, wouldn't be something that the Spanish government would necessarily want to do. It's quite possible that other markets outside the UK are affected by a Brexit. Now, you could speculate as to which countries outside the EU would benefit. Perhaps it could be an ex-Commonwealth country. India is an obvious example of a country that has big trading relationship with the UK, which could see increased trade flows. I would say that it's not impossible that what you see is that European markets, i.e. Eurozone markets or other European Union markets, begin to suffer in the event of a Brexit, because the UK is a significant trading partner within the European Union in both directions. And if you're looking at a big trading partner in the EU, you look at somewhere like Ireland. I think something like 30% of Irish goods, goods exports go to the UK. So I would be a bit concerned if I were an Irish exporter to the UK without a trade deal. Against that, if you're concerned about inward investment to the UK in the event of a Brexit, again, Ireland seems particularly well placed to benefit in that specific area. Over the last 5 years, there's been plenty of talk about European fragmentation, but it's important, once again, to differentiate between the European Union and the Eurozone. If a country leaves the European Union, then that has implications for markets, but nothing like as serious as a country leaving the Eurozone. And in particular, from 2010, particularly to around the middle of 2012 and periodically afterwards, the speculation has that Greece might leave the Eurozone. The great danger during the beginning part of that period was that you get a contagion effect, i.e. Greece leaves the Eurozone because it can't finance itself and the Eurozone is unwilling or unable to provide a suitable bailout. Therefore, the question is who's next? You then look at, in retrospect, the other bailout countries, Ireland, Portugal, arguably Spain because of its banking sector, and then there was speculation over Italy. So, that would have, massive repercussions for the euro area and for financial markets generally, given the shockwaves that would have brought to the global financial markets. We're not in that situation at the moment. In our view, there's a big row coming up over Greece and its third bailout. It's trying to conduct the first review of that third bailout. The IMF, for example, is saying it has to make budget savings of something like 4.5% of GDP, which is just really not a realistic option. And Greece has big debt maturities coming up in July. So it may well be that markets begin to speculate about Greece leaving the Eurozone at some stage. Now, I don't think that will happen, but speculation might be there. Now, the key difference between now and 4 years ago is that any problems in Greece are largely seen as idiosyncratic, i.e. not systemic. And there's a fair chance that, hypothetically, I stress, if Greece were to leave the Eurozone, then you'd see some shockwaves in Eurozone markets, but that would die down. You wouldn't get the who's next question, and then the most important question, which is, well, will the euro as a single currency survive? I think the European Central Bank has dealt with those issues very well, and I think markets are on a reasonably sufficiently firm footing to swipe those questions aside. In terms of the UK's fiscal deficit, we were really in an awful state 6 or 7 years ago, a peak of something like a deficit of £155 billion, which is around 11% of GDP. Now, the big rule of thumb is that it's a lot easier to increase your deficit than it is to bring it down. And as we've seen over the past 6 or 7 years or so, the deficit has come down, but it's been a gradual process. So we're now at a situation where the deficit's, say, about 4, perhaps 4.5% of GDP, more to go. It's very slow. And one of the reasons why is that it's difficult to cut spending. The UK has an ageing population. It's got a welfare model. And if your population is getting older, i.e. your dependency ratios are rising, you have a natural tendency for your spending to increase. And so you have to make budget savings in different directions. Now, it is difficult to bring that deficit down. It has been done. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Finance Minister, George Osborne's plan, indeed now it's enshrined in law as a fiscal mandate. He wants to hit a surplus by 2019-20. That's not assured, but it does look like a reasonable target, but it is going to take several more years of budget savings.